Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Peak, and I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We are so grateful that you have made time to join with us today. We know that many of you have been responding to a series of cascading crises, from climate-related disasters to COVID-19 to mass protests that have swept the nation. As always, we acknowledge those who are on the front lines of these catastrophes, from the healthcare workers to the emergency managers to the federal, state, and local officials, to the researchers and many others who are seeking to understand and work to reduce the many risks that people face. Today, you will hear one especially inspiring story of a collaborative effort to reduce landslide risk in Puerto Rico. Few announcements before we begin the formal webinar presentation. This forum is being recorded. The captioned webinar video and the presentation slides will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, which is hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access many other free resources. Thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, we can offer one contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive the credit, you are required to attend the entire webinar session today. Please visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. You can contact Katie Murphy, whose email address is on the website, for more information on receiving your certificate for attending this webinar today. If at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments, you can offer those either via the chat function or the Q&A box on Zoom. Our speakers will respond to questions as time permits during the webinar. For those questions we are unable to get to, we will share written responses via the Making Mitigation Work webinar page. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our 5 speakers for today's webinar. Please note that you can find the speakers' full and highly impressive bios on the Natural Hazard Center website. For now, let me please offer a brief introduction. Raquel Lugo Bendizu is a geology student at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayaguez, who has also served as an undergraduate research assistant on the Landslide project you will hear about today. Yahira Alvarez Gandia is also an undergraduate student from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayaguez, majoring in geology with an emphasis in natural resources. And she also, along with Raquel, served as an undergraduate research assistant on this project. We are so thrilled they've joined us today and look forward to hearing from them. Lindsay Davis is the Earthquake Disaster Assistant Team Manager at the U.S. Geological Survey. Before joining the USGS in the fall of 2019, Lindsay was a research associate here at the Natural Hazard Center, where she played a leading role in launching and initiating the Landslide project. Jonathan Gott is the coordinator of the U.S. Geological Survey Landslide Hazards Program and is responsible for directing the only federal program devoted to landslide science and risk reduction. Jonathan has received many accolades throughout his career, but around here, we hold him up as the visionary who both birthed the idea for the Landslide Guide and helped bring Lindsay Davis to the center. For that, we are forever grateful for him. Last, but certainly not least, Jocelyn West is a graduate research assistant here at the Natural Hazard Center and a doctoral student in sociology. Before joining us here at the University of Colorado Boulder, Jocelyn worked on global risk communication efforts and other initiatives through the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I could say so much more about each of these 5 speakers, but I want to end this introduction by saying this. Not only are they extraordinary researchers and practitioners and policymakers, they are also a team that has come together for a broader vision and through a commitment to the people and the island of Puerto Rico. It is truly my honor to welcome our speakers today. So now I'm going to stop sharing my slides and we'll turn this over to our first presenter, Jonathan Gott. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Lori.
Oh, there we go, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so pleased today to kick off this webinar that will describe a collaborative process that we use to create a landslide guidebook and other materials to communicate the risk from landslides in Puerto Rico. And you can switch to the next slide. Thank you. So the idea for this project came out of response efforts to Hurricane Maria back in 2017. And one of the devastating impacts of the storm was the widespread landslides that were generated by the heavy rain. The USGS was asked to send a team of geologists to assist the federal response in Puerto Rico, and our role there was to identify any ongoing landslide threats and provide recommendations to the federal response and recovery efforts. Landslides are a frequent and common hazard in Puerto Rico, but the number and extent of landsliding from Hurricane Maria was truly exceptional. Rainfall from the hurricane triggered more than 70,000 landslides that impacted most of the mountainous parts of the island. Our work took us across the island over a period of a couple weeks, and our conversations with local emergency response officials and planning officials identified the need for both some scientific products to help decisions about landslide risk, such as maps, but also educational materials, including the landslide guide we're going to talk about today. So the USGS was tasked to deliver a variety of scientific studies and products to assist with the recovery and rebuilding efforts after Hurricane Maria. And we also developed this landslide guide to complement those efforts and to support a broader campaign of landslide risk awareness. A few of the scientific products are shown on this slide here and include a Landslide Inventory, which is a digital database of the location of each of those more than 70,000 landslides. And this database was used to create a landslide susceptibility map for the entire island. That effort was led by Stephen Hughes, who is a geology professor at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and Bill Schultz, a landslide geologist at the USGS. The map data and the susceptibility map were recently released and can be accessed at the link shown on below the map there on the slide. And we at the USGS are also working on other studies and products to help understand and manage the landslide risk in Puerto Rico. The Landside Guidebook is a 16-page booklet available in both Spanish and English, and the guide and a variety of related products can be downloaded from the project webpage located at hazards.colorado.edu/Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is all one word. The guide and other landslide education materials have been designed to complement the science products and help a variety of stakeholders to discuss landslide hazard and risk with the residents of Puerto Rico. And finally, the Landslide Guide has provided a fantastic opportunity for the USGS and the Natural Hazards Center to take advantage of a long-standing cooperation by partnering to respond to the needs of the residents of Puerto Rico. The guidebook project began back in 2018, as you'll see in just a moment, quickly expanded to include students and faculty from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. Their participation was critical to ensuring the risk communication materials were developed in a way that put the residents, students, and professionals of Puerto Rico at the center. This slide highlights some of the team members from the 3 organizations, and I'll close by saying I couldn't be happier with their efforts and the results, and I hope we can use this experience as a model for other activities in the future. And now we're going to conduct a quick poll. so that we can get a sense of the different sectors represented in today's webinar participants. And then I'll hand it over to Lindsay Davis to talk a bit more about the guide itself.
Nice. And for those of you on the phone, the question today was, into which category does your work fall? And about half of our webinar participants today say they're with federal, national, tribal, or territorial government. About 18% are with an academic institution, 16% with state government, and then the remainder from local government and the private sector. And so thank you so much to everybody for joining with us today. And Jonathan, thank you for that wonderful launch. And I'll stop sharing the poll results right now. And Lindsay, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lori. Can you still see the slides?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. As Lori and Jonathan mentioned, my name is Lindsay Davis and I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. I'd like to start by saying that in this presentation, we'd like to call your attention to the fact that the Landslide Guide has multiple distinct purposes for the many stakeholders who help to bring it to life, which for us is the most important thing to understand about the guide. The guide is a risk communication product, but because of the process we use to create it, the guide also has all of these other meanings and purposes. We use the guide's development to build and nurture a diverse network of stakeholders who helped create and improve the guide, which in turn provided an opportunity to broaden the risk communication effort. Many of the scientists, professors, practitioners, students, and others that participated in providing the content or reviewing the guide remain involved in helping to promote the guide across the island, for which we're very grateful. We saw the guide as a starting point and the process used to create it as an opportunity to foster the relationships necessary to share information about landslide risk with many people and through many channels. So this roadmap represents the steps we took throughout this project, starting with the request from stakeholders in Puerto Rico in 2017. It includes the effort to collect the necessary information to inform thoughtful development of the guide, graphic design and draft development, review and feedback, and release of the guide. We're currently in the phase of the project in which we have developed a communications and outreach plan, which we're using to direct the print and digital distribution of the Landslide Guide, as well as the development of complementary tools and products that address additional stakeholder needs and requests. This project was designed to be inclusive and to focus on co-production as the primary mechanism by which the guide was produced. The goals of the project extend beyond creating a paper guide about landslide hazards. All right, next I'd like to discuss a little bit about the information gathering phase of the project. So this preliminary phase involved three major components. First, a systematic review of landslide guides that had been produced by other organizations in the past, both within and outside of Puerto Rico. One of our favorite examples of a well-made guide was produced by the Washington and Oregon Geological Surveys. Second, we created an annotated bibliography of relevant literature that focused on risk communication. And third, we used a snowball sampling approach to connect with relevant stakeholders through a system of referrals. Throughout this process, we conducted informal interviews and focus groups. In addition to informing the content of the guide, the network we built for this project underpinned every additional stage of the project. Many stakeholders from across the island contributed content and photos to the guide, acted as reviewers, or are an active part of the plan to disseminate and publicize the guide. Based on the information we gathered, we were able to develop an initial concept for the Landslide Guide. At a minimum, the guide needed to meet the criteria listed here. We knew we wanted the guide to be developed in Spanish by native Puerto Rican Spanish speakers and to be translated into English after completion. It needed to be highly visual to accommodate the needs of a population with different literacy rates and multiple spoken languages. It had to be easy to understand since there are varying levels of education throughout the island, particularly in the interior mountains, which have had some of the highest landslide potential. It needed to be scientifically accurate and culturally relevant with respect to Puerto Rico. And we also wanted the guide to be endorsed and used by a wide variety of stakeholders throughout the island. We had a desire to incorporate local stakeholders into the development of the guide from the beginning. The process of selecting an appropriate counterpart was part of the information gathering and networking stage. And a team from the University of Puerto Rico Mayaguez joined the project as our primary counterpart. Stephen Hughes, who, as you heard, was already working with the USGS on the scientific products mentioned earlier, offered to collaborate on the Landslide Guide as well. We put out a call for applications and hired 2 undergraduate geology students from the University of Puerto Rico Mayaguez to work as research assistants on the project. Both students received stipends and school credit for their participation in the project. All right, now I'm going to pass it off to Yahaira Alvarez to talk about how the undergraduates became involved in the project and to share some of her experience related to landslides and Hurricane Maria.
Do everything looks okay?
It does. Thank you, Yahaira.
Sure. So hi everyone, my name is Yahaira and I'm going to share our experience with landslide hazards in Puerto Rico. As a geology undergrad students, we were aware about landslides, but it was not until Hurricane Maria that we were more conscious about how dangerous they could be. As Puerto Ricans, going through this atmospheric event made us see things from a different perspective. We saw the roads obstructed by large rocks and debris flows in many parts of the island. We also had the opportunity to volunteer with a group from the UPRM to help in one of the most affected municipalities, Utuado, located in the mountainous regions of the island. Once we got to Utuado, we saw how people lost their homes and belongings as the rubble and mud had entered through their houses' windows and their cars were trapped in sediment. They were emotional when telling us about their experience during the hurricane, but despite everything, they were grateful to have survived. People had lost their houses. As we can see in the images, the sediment entered through the windows of the residents and reached the kitchen, leaving the entire house covered in mud. We were tasked with working on the draft of the landslide guide, including helping to decide on the content of the guide and to design the content for the landslide guide. We developed the guide in Adobe Illustrator in Spanish first and later translated into English. As part of the process, we learned to work with the design software, which we had not used before. We also use examples from other landslide guides along with our knowledge of Puerto Rico to create pages to illustrate the content chosen by the team. This is an example from the guide that shows natural phenomena that trigger landslide as well as human activities that contribute to landslide susceptibility. This project has allowed us to develop many professional skills and become proficient in the use of graphic design programs. Some of our tasks have included designing the landslide guide and extending that information into other products like social media posts and presentation decks that emergency managers can use to educate their communities, as well as having the opportunity to go to conferences and present our work while simultaneously learning about other projects in the hazards and mitigation field. These conferences have served as a very useful way to show the guide to hazards professionals and gain their feedback for improvement. The conferences we have present are the National Hazard Center Workshop, GSA, and the RISE Conference. We are proud to have contributed to this project. We believe this guide has been and will be beneficial to Puerto Ricans as an effort to raise awareness and educate people on the island about landslide hazards. Collaboration with locals have been a main focus to make sure the information is relevant to Puerto Ricans. Our advice for future projects that are looking to collaborate with other institutions is to immerse themselves in the communities and find local institutions and professionals to offer, if possible, professional opportunities like internship to undergrads, have an array of different people in the reviewing process, and be open to ideas. Now I'm going to pass control to Jocelyn.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Jocelyn, a PhD student and graduate research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. I joined this project in August 2019 during the stage when we were sharing complete drafts of the Landslide Guide with stakeholders for review. We were gathering feedback and making revisions based on what we heard. And I'd like to give an overview now of this part of the process. When a draft of the guide was ready for review, we reached back out to the original network of people from the beginning of the project who were involved with the stakeholder needs assessment that Lindsay mentioned. This group completed more than 15 reviews of the Landside Guide. Their feedback helped verify and improve many aspects of the guide, and that included everything from scientific information to the mitigation advice, graphic design, and the translations between Spanish and English. One overarching goal of the revision process was to reduce the amount of text and communicate the same ideas through graphics and imagery. These visual aids help improve understanding and make the guide more engaging for everyone. They also make the information more accessible to low literacy audiences, including young children. And in the example that you see on the slide, we see pages from the guide, which show a before and after of versions of the pages for mitigation measures and advice for preparing an emergency kit or backpack. The research assistants took the lead on designing graphical representations of this kind of information. As we were putting finishing touches on the Landside Guide, we started planning ahead for how we would distribute the guide both in print and online. We began developing a communications and outreach plan well in advance of the expected release date for the Landside Guide. This document serves as a hub for the overall risk communication strategy. We use it in our team meetings to track progress, identify gaps, and choose our next steps. A key component is identifying our audiences, which there were many of. And there's a lot of overlap in the audiences listed here with those who were the collaborators involved from the beginning of the project. From early on, our strategy for the guide has been to share it with groups and organizations that interface directly with communities in Puerto Rico on a regular basis. So the guide was designed with both practitioners and residents in mind. The communications and outreach plan is vital not only during the planning and implementation phases, but also for future monitoring and evaluation purposes of this project. As outlined in our logic model, it will help us report on how the guide was distributed and utilized down the road. With the communications plan, we prepared to publicly release Spanish and English language versions of the Landside Guide. To do so, we aligned the communications workflows at the Natural Hazard Center and the U.S. Geological Survey. Our partner, Stephen Hughes from UPRM, had the chance to do a test launch of sorts on a Spanish language news show with Automon Son, who is one of the most trusted meteorologists in Puerto Rico. This was a chance for us to practice our message and see what the reception to the guide would be like. We received a dozen requests by email for the guide after the show, which was promising. And then a month later, we were able to share the official launch of the guide with our digital networks. And once again, Ada Monzon was a champion for the Landslide Guide on social media, where she has up to 1 million followers. As part of the communications plan, we also created a spreadsheet to track the many requests that we received for the Landside Guide and to track the distribution of physical copies of the guide. We started by printing 1,000 copies of the Spanish language guide in Puerto Rico. And since then, the UPRM team has been distributing physical copies to our partners. We also ask partners to share with us how they are using the guides in their work with communities and whether physical or digital copies are preferred. After the stakeholders have had a chance to use the guide in education and outreach activities more, we plan to conduct surveys or interviews to better understand how the guide was used and whether the content is appropriate or needs to be updated, and if there are any additional needs for other tools or content. Coming back to our roadmap, while the completion and distribution of the Landside Guide appears near the end, it's really the start of another process that we've been working on, which involves iteration and complementary tools for landslide risk communication. So the Landside Guide is just the first product in a diverse array of tools and activities for communicating landslide risk. There are some other complementary tools, as you can see here, that have recently been developed and released to the public on our website. And these include presentation slides about landslides and the purpose of the guide, which came at the request of our partners at the Puerto Rico Planning Board, as well as the San Juan National Weather Service. The Planning Board plans to use the slides as part of their trainings for building inspectors. We have also developed promotional flyers, presented this work at conferences, and created scripts that can be read on the radio. The story map tells the broader story of landslides in Puerto Rico by connecting the geospatial data from the USGS Landslide Inventory to the information in the Landslide Guide. On the website, which again is hazards.colorado.edu/Puerto Rico, you can also find a newly released animation that does a great job of explaining the content of the Landslide Guide. And we continuously collect feedback from our partners and any of you who are watching about ways to share this information in Puerto Rico or other ideas for additional products that could be made. And now Raquel is going to walk you through 2 examples of these products that the team has developed to complement and build upon the Landslide Guide.
And Raquel, we can see your screen, but can't quite hear you yet.
Sorry, everyone. Can you hear me now?
That is perfect.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now.
Wonderful, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Raquel. First, we would like to take you through a brief example of one of the complementary products, a publicly available slide deck that helps explain the content and provide context for the Landslide Guide. This slide and the next few slides are a part of the slide deck available for download on the website. This slide deck is beneficial for anyone that wants to bring this information to their communities. As mentioned earlier, the guide was created to inform residents and professionals in Puerto Rico about landslide risk. It was also created with the intent to raise awareness in a simple and illustrative way about what a landslide is, how to identify them, what to do if your family and property are at risk, how to prepare your emergency backpack, and more. On this slide, we see that the image on the right shows an example of how devastating a landslide can be. This landslide occurred in 2013 in the Villa España community in Bayamón. It is a recent example that will be familiar to many people in Puerto Rico. Several families were evacuated in the emergency. The causes of this landslide were attributed to the constant rains that the limestone tower had received on previous days. There's a really famous YouTube video that went viral about this event. Many of us know this event for the neighbors calling Tati to evacuate her residents. The video can be accessed via the YouTube link at the bottom, and we are going to show part of it in the next slide. The duration that we show is about 1 minute, and as a heads up, it may be loud, so you might wanna turn down your volume a little bit. This slide illustrates the natural phenomena that can cause landslides on the left, and to the right, we see the human activities that contribute to land susceptibility. Natural causes can include saturation of the soil, while human activities might include improper drainage on slopes. We also explain some of the signs that may indicate possible landslide development, which should not be overlooked. This page of the guide shows the signs or hints in the natural environment that indicate that the terrain is susceptible to landslides. It helps teach people what to look for around where they live. In this image, we show the possible signs of landslides, but this time in infrastructure. We emphasize that it is important to always be alert to the signs, and you do not have to wait to identify them all before taking action. In this part, we highlight the recommended mitigation measures to follow. It is important to follow these measures as they can help to reduce landslide risk. Especially, officials should encourage residents to avoid making cuts on terrain with steep slopes because this will help to maintain its stability and avoid rockfalls that could cause car accidents if it is near the road or loss of residents if it occurs in a community. If culverts are not used water will accumulate, supersaturating the ground and causing it to lose cohesion and detach easily. Plants, through their roots, help provide stability to the ground as they function as networks that keep everything in place. But if we cut down trees or do not plant, the land will not have that support. Finally, you should always consult a professional before building. As with other hazards, it is of utmost importance that all families have their emergency backpacks and other preparedness items ready. Here, this image from the guide shows the reader an example of items that should be included in your emergency backpack. Of course, each family should also personalize the pack to fit their needs. For example, during the current pandemic, packs might also include masks and hand sanitizer. For more information, access the link down below, www.listo.gov/es. As with the mitigation practices discussed, the response and recovery is very important. On the left of the slide, the graphic illustrates what to do during a landslide, even if you cannot vacate the building in time. The recommendations on the right indicate what to do after the landslide event has occurred. Now we are going to show an animation made to promote the guide online through social media.
¿Has pensado qué pasaría si tu propiedad fuera afectada por un deslizamiento de tierra? Luego del huracán María, se registraron más de 70,000 deslizamientos de tierra alrededor de todo Puerto Rico. Los deslizamientos de tierra no solo son producto de fenómenos naturales como saturación de agua en el suelo, pendientes escarpadas y terremotos, sino que también pueden ser inducidos por actividades humanas. Las zonas de relleno, los sistemas de riego, la excavación para construcciones, los drenajes en pendientes, entre otros, son contribuyentes a la susceptibilidad de deslizamiento de tierra.
Why this work remains urgent. The 2020 earthquake sequence in southwest Puerto Rico also revealed some of the island's vulnerabilities to landslides. The earthquakes triggered rockfalls on a few major highways, which inhibited movement of people and emergency services needed amid the ongoing earthquakes. As you can see in the photo on the bottom right, large landslides occurred in close proximity to a school after this event. Houses across the island are also frequently constructed in ways that are susceptible to damage from landslides and earthquakes. Therefore, it remains an urgent task to improve public awareness of landslides while strengthening the network of practitioners and researchers in Puerto Rico who are committed to landslide mitigation. We would like to close by recognizing and thanking the many contributors and reviewers of the Landslide Guide. And we would like to acknowledge the generous funding provided by the U.S. Geological Survey, made possible by the Additional Supplemental Appropriations for Disaster Requirements Act 2018, along with support from the Natural Hazard Center, NSF, and the San Juan, Puerto Rico Science, Technology and Research Trust. Thank you for attending our presentation. As a reminder, you can download the Spanish and English versions of the Landslide Guide, as well as the other products discussed at hazards.colorado.edu/Puerto Rico. We welcome your questions in the time we have left or by email after the talk.
Thank you so much, Raquel, and thank you to all of the other panelists, to Yahaira and Lindsay, Jocelyn, and Jonathan. Thank you for the time, effort, and care that you clearly put into this presentation. And thank you also for reserving some time for questions. And so again, if you're out there listening and watching the webinar, please know that you can either use the Q&A box or the chat box. And I'm going to go ahead and read the questions out loud for our participants who are on the telephone, and then we'll turn it back over to our fantastic panelists. So I'm actually going to start out with a question from Krista, who said, and another important community to engage is K through 12 education system, public and private. I understand the editorial Panamericana will be releasing soon an earthquake guide for schools, which will have a half page dedicated to the guide. So I'm going to turn that comment over to Lindsay Davis, because I think you can speak to the partnerships with schools and some of the K through 12 efforts that have been ongoing. So Lindsay, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think just in general, it was interesting from the beginning of this project, because I think being an early career professional myself, it's been fun to kind of involve students in the project. And so it was actually Stephen Hughes' idea to co-supervise undergraduate students, and that's how the partnership with UPRM sort of started. This was just during one of our stakeholder meetings where I was reaching out because I had, been talking to various people at UPRM. But I think that's ended up being one of the most beneficial parts of our project. Is Raquel and Yahaira have brought an amazing amount of just depth to this entire project, and it would not have been the same without the participation of university counterparts. So that, and I think that just, continuing in those efforts is going to be great. Did that answer the question fully?
Lindsay, I think that is great. And then can you also speak to, are there any other collaborations specifically with K through, people who are working with K through 12 on the island? Thank you.
So I would say a lot of the collaborations specifically with K through 12 are mostly related to our work with Eco Exploratorio. So as Jocelyn mentioned, with Ada Monzon, she is the founder of the Science Museum Eco Exploratorio. And so we've recently been partnering with them on various initiatives. So one of those was that recently both Yahaira and Raquel were invited presenters and completed a webinar with them. And they'll also be doing a presentation at a science camp run by Eco Exploratorio at the end of this week. So I think we haven't directly partnered with K through 12 schools, but through our work with Eco Exploratorio and the partnerships that we've formed, I think that's probably the best representation. Raquel or Yahaira, do you have anything to add about your experience working with them?
Hi, yes, it has been amazing working with Eco Exploratorio, and we have been very excited for all the activities that we have done and the webinar that we are going to do on Friday.
Yes, and we are very happy for this opportunity because our objective is to reach as many people as possible, because we think this guide is a way to save life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to Jana's question. And Jonathan, I think I'm going to direct this to you first. Jana asked, can you please recommend any native, especially edible or medicinal plants that can be planted to help stabilize slopes in landslide prone areas? And are there specific planting methods to facilitate success?
That's a fantastic question. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert in sort of the green mitigation solutions, particularly in Puerto Rico. Those are activities, or those are mitigation strategies that are used in other parts of the world. But I don't have specific recommendations to give. One thing we can try to do is to follow up with the Department of Agriculture and any of the extension offices there to see if they have any specific recommendations for Puerto Rico.
Wonderful, thank you. Next, we have 2 questions from Chris Ludwig with the U.S. Geological Survey. So I'm going to start with the first and then we'll go to the second. So the first question is, where else could this process be replicated to mitigate landslide risk? Is there any place that is quote unquote primed for using a similar guide outside of Puerto Rico? And are there plans to work with these communities? So essentially the first question is sort of about the transferability of the guide to other places. And so Lindsay, I'm going to turn it to you first and then see if you have others that you might recommend respond to this one.
Sure. So my initial thought, Chris, is that I think, along the process of creating the guide, just in some of those meetings, I was connected with people who are working on similar projects elsewhere in the world. So, for example, there's a PhD student in New Zealand who's working on similar outreach in, I believe, Bangladesh. And so we met a couple of times and discussed ideas. In terms of the specific transferability of the landslide guide, I think at this point, we've worked particularly hard to make sure that it was directly suited to Puerto Rico, but I think the process is very transferable. So in order to make a product that is specialized to a particular area, I think we can take the framework. For example, we referenced those other guides that had been created in sort of the initial stages of this project, and then used that to build off of to make sure that it was relevant to the areas in which we were working in Puerto Rico. I don't know, Jocelyn, do you have any thoughts about having come from working with the World Bank on this topic?
Hi, I think I would echo a lot of what you said. As we often do in these conversations about risk communication, we would probably have to emphasize, yeah, exactly as Chris said it, like that the process could be replicated, but it might not be a guide that is arrived at as the product that is needed in a particular place. We've been so focused on Puerto Rico in the scope of this project that we have just sort of begun to think about where else kind of within the realm of the US might have similar needs with respect to landslides specifically. Yeah,
so this is Jonathan. You mind if I jump in real quick? That's a great question, Chris. And I think one of the reasons that this effort has been, at least we think it's going to be successful or has the appearance of being effective in Puerto Rico, is because of the frequency of the hazard there. And the other places that occur to me where landslides are frequent, and that this might be a place to investigate, is in recently burned areas, particularly in California and other western states of the US, strikes me as a possibility.
And Chris, thank you, Jonathan, Jocelyn, and Lindsay for that follow-up. And Chris, for everybody on the phone who can't see the Q&A box, Chris also asked a second question that I think you just started to hear the threads of an answer to, about if one were to use this process for developing risk communication products to mitigate risk from other hazards such as flooding, coastal storm, wildfire, or multiple hazards, compound hazards like landslides plus hurricane plus pandemic. Are there other elements that would need to be changed? And if so, how? And so I'm going to move on to Alicia's question next, but I am going to put a plug in for this wonderful team that yet another product that they are working on right now is a scholarly article, which is actually unpacking both the products that they've created, but also the process, which Chris, your questions are very much about that. So I hope that that will be a major breakthrough of this effort, which is really writing down and solidifying this beautiful collaborative process that you heard about today. So thank you, Chris. And next over to Alicia. She asked, what is the spatial resolution of the landslide susceptibility map that you showed at the outset, Jonathan?
So the spatial resolution of that susceptibility map, if I've got it correct, it was based on a LiDAR data set, so in essence, a remotely sensed topographic data set. So the data, the final product itself is either at a meter resolution or 10-meter resolution. And unfortunately, I don't have the details right in front of me, but it's at quite fine scale, I guess is the way I'll say.
Thank you. Diva said, wonderful work, congratulations, and ask, how have you seen municipalities incorporate housing in imminent danger of landslides into their emergency response or mitigation planning efforts? And so I think Lindsay and or Jonathan, can you tackle that one, please?
Yeah, could you repeat that one more time, Lori? It's a long question, so I want to make sure that I'm getting the whole thing.
Of course. So Diva wanted to know, how have you seen municipalities incorporate housing in imminent danger of landslides into their emergency response or mitigation planning efforts?
So thanks Diva for that, and nice to see you on. I would say the majority of my experience has been in the community of Puerto, and it seems like there are different organizations that are kind of trying to tease that out, either working with the municipal hazard planning level and or the emergency manager himself kind of going door to door. He does a phenomenal job there. And so I think, I mean, that's one of the things that's really difficult, right? Because, you know, individual homeowners want this information, but there's also kind of this line that we have to be careful not to cross of giving too specific of information, because every single person's residence is in a different location and has all of these different factors that can't possibly be addressed in one education campaign, right? So we tend to try to encourage them to seek professional assistance, but you know, on a case-by-case basis, and that tends to be a little bit difficult depending on other priorities. You know, if somebody is kind of trying to recover from a disaster, it's much more difficult for them to say, oh yes, I want to spend this $4,000 going to get a geotechnical investigation. And so I think one of the things that I've spent a lot of time talking to emergency managers about is, you know, how to help guide individual families through processes like this. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, and I would be thrilled to have a conversation offline about that, because it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Does anybody else on the team have thoughts about that?
Lindsay, this is Jonathan. I'll only add, and Diva, thanks for the question. The only thing I'll add is that the susceptibility map itself was developed in concert or with consultation to the Puerto Rico Planning Board, and so they were, you know, ultimately one of the stakeholders that was involved with that.
Thank you. So Alicia, I know the team described many partnerships today, but Alicia wanted to know about the integration of the educational materials. Have you also connected with faith-based organizations with your on-the-ground partnerships? So I think Lindsay, Jocelyn, Raquel, and Yahaira, any integration with faith-based organizations you can speak to?
Not so much from my end. I don't know, Raquel and Yahaira, when you responded after Hurricane Maria, did your groups connect with faith-based organizations, or do you have any personal experience with that? No. One other thing I will mention is we have worked with the Cultural Center in Utuado, but not so much with any individual faith-based organizations. But I think we would be open to that as a team.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you for raising the question. Next, we have a question about access and functional needs. So does the guide take into consideration the deaf community or people with access and functional needs?
Jocelyn, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the derivative products that are audio-based?
Sure. I really appreciate this question, and I think there's a couple of like levels at which I could try to answer it, but I'd say that you know, in the way that we created the guide itself and additional products so far, we've tried to make sure that the same information could be conveyed through a variety of like mediums. So visually, through text, but also through graphics and imagery. But we've also created the animation, which has currently been released, has the same information like in an audio format. We've also created scripts in Spanish and English that communicate information about landslide risk itself, but also information about how to access the guide. Those could be read on radio or on like social media or interviews with different organizations on the internet. So I think in terms of communicating the information, we've been doing our best so far to continue thinking about providing the information here so far in a variety of ways that make it accessible to folks with different needs. But I think there's another way of looking at this question that involves like, do the recommendations themselves in the guide account for people with different needs? And I think they are generally very broad at this point, but we don't make specific recommendations about like folks with limited sight or hearing. But we do provide information about different ways that signs of landslides could be recognized. And so many of those are visual, but they also involve like the sounds that landslides make when they do happen. We know that they're often mistaken sometimes for earthquakes or even just like construction equipment working. So I'd say those are just some of the things that we've been thinking about as we continue this process, but we definitely, if any of our attendees have ideas about how to make the information or the specific recommendations for mitigation of landslides more accessible to specific communities, we would certainly welcome those. Thank you for this question.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to all of the participants on the webinar. Katie just let me know that for the first time ever, we had almost 100% participation rate in terms of who signed up for this webinar and who showed up for it. And so I think this speaks to the power of this team, and thank you to all of our presenters today. Thank you to our participants for your questions and recommendations. And I'm sorry that we're running out of time today, but know that we're going to download the questions from the chat and Q&A, and these 5 fantastic presenters will respond, and we will make sure and post those on the Hazard Center website. And so before we close at the top of the hour, in addition to thanking our panelists and to thanking all of you for being here, please remember to visit the Natural Hazard Center website under the research tab or at hazards.colorado.edu/Puerto Rico to download the guide, but also all of these supplemental materials that you heard about today. It's also on the Hazard Center website where you'll be able to find the recording from this webinar so you can share it and also share the slides, and where you'll find the answers to your wonderful questions and comments that again we will share. Please know that we will be taking a hiatus from making mitigation work, our webinar series in July, as we are going to be busy hosting our 45th annual, but first ever virtual Natural Hazards Research and Applications Workshop. The workshop will be held July 12th through 15th, and we hope that you will join us. Our theme is Active Hope, and registration is now open. And the workshop will be followed by a researchers meeting on July 15th and 16th, where the focus will be the data revolution, ethical imperatives, and methodological considerations. Registration for this meeting is also now open. So with that, thank you again to our speakers, thank you to our participants, and to everyone out there during this time, this tumultuous time. Please remember to take care of yourself and others. Have a great day. Bye.